what kind of car that could mean then that could go in there and, you know.
And I know the applicant is prepared to address that. There is already provision in the bylaw at a certain threshold where you can have a certain number of short stalls. A pickup truck, for example, might be difficult to fit into one of these spots, but it is anticipated in the official plan that sometimes in order to accomplish some kind of a public interest, some stalls can be shorter than others.
And in this case, on parking, the applicant is not against you on this, which is
no. This motion has the support of the applicant, and Brian Casagrande has reiterated that.
Councillor Blais, did you have a question?
Trying to understand what the effect of the motion is.
If we need to make a couple of shallower parking spots in order to take those further away from that bur oak on the site, we'll have the flexibility to do so in the zoning, rather than getting to site plan, seeing the potential to reduce the size of some of those lots in order to protect the tree, and then having to come back for a zoning amendment in order to be able to accomplish that. So it provides us the flexibility we need today.
So you're removing additional parking above the decrease that's already being recommended in the report?
No, sorry, so I'll read it out one more time. Therefore, be it resolved that the zoning be amended to permit 3 of the parking spots on the property to have a minimum depth of 4.6 meters. The bylaw ordinarily would require that those be 5.2 meters.
Okay. That's it? So on the motion with regard to the parking and the reduction in the length of 3 of the spaces, 3 spaces, is that carried? Thank you. And then on the motion to move this, okay, on the item as amended, carried. And then on the motion to move it to council tomorrow, carried? Yeah. Because the next council meeting isn't for a full month from now, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody. So the next item up is 851 Industrial Avenue. It's a zoning bylaw amendment for diamond storage, and we will go right to speakers. Brian Orendorff, are you here? Brian is here with the Riverview Park Community Association, followed by Bliss Edwards. You just press the button and the light will turn red. Thank you. And you have a presentation?
I have something I'm going to read out, but there is...
I just don't know. What were you just doing there, Matt?
I was just loading the next one.
Okay.
But Matt, there's a...
your map, yes.
Yeah, if you could put it up. You can put it up anytime.
Okay. Whenever you're ready. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hello to you all. My name is Brian Orendorff, and I'm here as a representative of the Riverview Park Community Association to speak on the application. Like many neighborhoods in the city, Riverview has been subject to substantial development applications in recent years. In many cases, the association and the wider community can perhaps be categorized as accepting of and indeed sometimes supporting of well-planned, well-executed developments which are in keeping with the local context of the community. Unfortunately, we do not believe that this application is one of those developments, as in general, we do not believe it is in keeping with sound planning objectives as they relate to building height and a new retail use. As you're aware, a planning rationale is provided with each application. I would like to read to you as an example the proponent's rationale for additional height, which applies for basically an extra floor to a 4-story maximum. The requested relief from the permitted height of 18 meters to 22.3 meters will require amendment. It should be noted that the increase in height is necessary to achieve the design objectives, product, and service that is consistent with Diamond Management Limited. And that's it. This was the only content provided by the applicant with respect to rationalizing the height required for the building. When we met with city planners, city planner and the councillor, one of our members who is in the development industry remarked that this was the shortest non-rationale he had seen in 25 years. The retail rationale was equally weak. The rationale is basically, give us more height because we want it. It is not based on planning principles at all. This lack of sound planning objectives was reiterated to the Community Association when the proponent was invited to and made a presentation at our board meeting on 21st of February. We asked the simple question, why do you need it? At that meeting, the response from the proponent was, in essence, because we can sell it. In addition, they pointed out that they thought they were entitled to a more significant amendment to get 9 stories for their site if the owner had wanted it. For those in the know, with respect to planning applications, this message isn't terribly shocking, but it is very disappointing. Our association provided the city planner with a 4-page memo outlining all of the planning arguments we felt were applicable to the application with respect to the height and retail uses. These were all detailed planning-based arguments. We even included a construction feasibility analysis that supports a 4-story building being built on the site with a larger footprint, which would be less expensive from a construction operation perspective. As this is an economic advantage to the developer while still meeting the density objectives. When this application was first brought to our attention, we requested a context drawing to show how this property, as planned, compares to the nearby buildings in the community. You can see it up there. What was provided was an overlay of the as-of-right-now footprint of all the buildings in the area with the maximum permissible building envelope for each property, and the new application shown as proposed. The idea being to suggest that if every other site in the neighborhood was built to its maximum footprint and maximum height over the next few years, the proponent's proposal would then be in context. Frankly, that sort of demonstrative argument is a little ridiculous considering that most of the newer buildings are less than 2 stories. Imagine what that exercise would look like in an older area full of detached homes, say like Hampton Park, Manor Park, Riverside Park, or Carlton Heights. If you told those residents that's what their subdivision was intended to look like, they'd probably throw a fit. When we talk about the community changing over time, the existing use matters. In this case, the maximum permissible use is pretty extreme in the context of the neighboring properties. Asking for more is truly excessive. We are uncertain how this application was recommended by the assigned planner, given that there were no substantive arguments put forward by the applicant, and we have yet to receive any response from the detailed planning-based memo that we provided. We're trying to work with the other stakeholders, but we keep running into walls, which is what brings me here today, to take the message directly to the committee. This proposal is bad planning. It defeats the purpose of restricted uses and building heights in a local context. The request was not supported by any rationale, and the precedent it sets for future applications will be detrimental to the future of the local context of the community. If approved, this will essentially open the door to excessive new heights, no doubt each larger than the last, for every single new application. Landowners will also know that a rationale is not required. You just have to ask. The community is willing and able to tolerate manageable change, but to make change manageable, it needs to fall within the rules. This application does not. We are hopeful that you will support the community and its position and vote no for both of these zoning amendments. Thank you very much.
Before I go to Councillor Nussbaum, do you want to tell me where your community is, where you actually live in relation to this?
Do you mean the community
houses,
association
the
or myself personally?
Your community, the community of residents.
The community of Riverview Park is bounded by...
Coronation?
Pardon?
You're on the other side of Russell from Coronation?
Yes, so those houses on the south end are... Oh, there's a pointer. Yeah, so most of the houses are going to be there. I mean, the community association also extends on all sides of this, but the majority of the houses are going to be on the south side of industrial. Yeah.
Oh, there aren't any houses directly on the south side of industrial, though.
That's correct. No, sorry, on the south side of, I believe this is Russell.
Yeah, because that's what I'm having a hard time understanding, to tell you the truth.
Oh,
so I listened to your arguments. I'm just not seeing how they can have a direct impact. But I'm going to go to Councillor Nussbaum. Councillor Nussbaum?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming out this afternoon. I didn't have the benefit of reading your 4-page submission, so if I could just ask very, very briefly, what is the adverse impact that you would anticipate from the 5-story building per se? I understand you've got sort of a larger policy rationale about arguments in favor of rezoning, but is there a particular adverse impact that you're concerned about should council approve from 18 to 23 meters?
The biggest impact is the cumulative impacts. You know, we can talk about traffic and this and that, but I think that's not
Sorry,
a strong...
what did you say? The biggest impact is what?
Cumulative impacts within the community.
Who? Oh, cumulative, sorry.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
That's really the big thing, that, you know, the planning rationale is so poor. If that sets a precedence, then every single other application along industrial just has to kind of ask. There doesn't have to be a context. You know, if there was a context provided by the applicant, then it might be supportable. And in fact, we provided a bunch of, to the city planner, a number of planning-based arguments that, you know, could support this type of development, but with a lower height, same density and all that kind of stuff.
And similar question with regard to the proposed retail use. What would be the adverse impact?
The adverse impact, again, is the same. It's the cumulative effects. Just because there is a very weak planning rationale, we have a really hard time guaranteeing that every new development that comes along is going to not just ask for more amendments, without sound planning rationale.
Okay, the reason I'm asking the question is I'm looking at Google Maps, and across the street there is a mall, I guess they're zoned as light industrial usages. I don't know what, but they're essentially client-oriented, sort of consumer-oriented shops. And I'm just trying to understand, as I listen, what the substantive difference is between, in terms of the use of that area, between a retail use on the one side of the street and a light industrial use which permits the same type of usage on the other.
To be honest, I am not a planner myself. All I know is that at some point, somebody with a lot more planning experience and background than I did decided that it was a good idea to organize the zoning in that way.
Okay.
We would just like that to be maintained.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
Thank you. Councillor Kluche, please.
Thank you. Brian, what is there? We've talked in the Community Association about the vision for industrial and how it will change over time, cycling, and because it's a quick way to get to Herdman Station right at the end. How does this fit into that vision?
So our vision for industrial is basically what you see there as, you know, in the yellow and orange. You know, we're prepared to tolerate, definitely, it's got a lot of good development opportunities, but the change has to be manageable. Going from one-story buildings to six-story buildings, eight-story buildings, nine-story buildings is a big change. We like the current maximums of the proposed zoning, or rather we are prepared to be supportive of that level of change, but outside of the established zoning, the established regulations, we find that to be excessive.
Thank you. And just the other issue is this map only shows a small portion. Industrial continues to go, and there is a lot of residences to the east of this site, and to Brian's point about precedence. I just want to put that on the table for the committee.
Yeah, I worked there for a lot of years at Loeb as a senior buyer, so I know the area very well. That's why I'm shocked actually at the thought of impact to people who live in the homes on Coronation and over here off of Russell and that. I just am surprised. I have a hard time understanding, that's all. Anybody else have any questions for Mr. Orndorff? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Bliss Edwards, please.
Thank you.
If you don't mind,
Oh, you surprised me.
if you don't mind, I was having a hard time containing myself.
But Chris
If-
Gordon isn't, I know, just settle down and relax. Is Chris Gordon, Chris, you're coming up separately? No, I can join now. Well, it's just you've written I got your name down here, so I figured that it must be tied into the applicant.
Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead, Mikhail.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. I will try to be brief. First, I want to assure the committee and repair some of the statements, the false statements that were made earlier, that a rationale was not submitted, and it was a very thoughtful, comprehensive rationale that relied heavily on the OP policies in terms of compatibility criteria of 251 and 411. And it also relied heavily on the emerging direction of OPA 180, which is the city's employment lands review. In the absence of a staff presentation, and given that I'm afforded a few more minutes, I will take a step back. The lands are designated employment, which is also reflected in the property's existing zoning, the IL zoning. It is a unique employment area in that it is characterized by a municipal works yard associated with your LRT that is forever expanding, and the city recently expropriated lands for the purpose of that yard. That becomes important later. The second larger defining element of this corridor is the Train Yards Regional Shopping Center. At an earlier time, the city chose to amend some designations and rezone the lands to allow for a regional shopping center, which now turns out is in very good proximity to LRT, so not necessarily a bad thing. Part of the issue with appropriating lands for your LRT is that you consumed some of your employment lands. The city in OPA 180 concluded that this is still a very good employment area, and yes, characterized in part by 1, 2, 3, and existing 5-story buildings. There's a retirement home on Industrial Avenue, which by coincidence, when we had our public meeting, was in a 5-story building on Industrial Avenue. Having said that, the fact that the city consumes some of those employment lands means that you have to get more out of what's left. Diamond is proposing, and to be clear, the IL zone allows for warehouse. The use is permitted. The self-storage use is permitted. We are often in front of this committee seeking to add self-storage to your arterial main streets and your mixed-use centers, and we'll do it again. But in this case here, we are actually already zoned. But what we're telling the city is we can actually get a little bit more into this and value your employment lands a little bit more. We are generally meeting all of the other zone provisions, but we want to go a little bit higher. A self-storage facility, you may recall from other applications, generates about 24 car trips a day. So it's not a significant intensity, but what this city concluded is that the self-storage use allows also other properties to develop more intensely. Diamond has boardrooms, meeting facilities, all sorts of other business services that allow a very good use of land in the employment area. With respect to the rationale that was in support of this, the city uses criterias in your official plan to decide if the additional height is appropriate in terms of impacts. It measures impacts in terms of shadowing, traffic, which I've just discussed, and I'll discuss again if you don't mind, Chris. There are very little issues associated with self-storage because unlike a 5-story residential building, which in this case would be located over 200 meters from the dwellings on the east side of Russell and separated again by other employment type uses, there are virtually no impacts. There's no balconies, there's no windows associated with self-storage. It is not intrusive in contrast to other types of land uses. In terms of the visual impacts along industrial, it's going to be set back approximately 24 meters. We did meet with the Community Association to respond to their two major concerns, height and retail, explained to them that the setback of 24 meters landscaped on industrial is the appropriate treatment and sufficiently mitigates for any impacts related to building height, this is the most recent Diamond elevations. They're evolving, as you might remember, from the Carling Avenue as well. But we were asked to put this building into context. The orange profiles are the existing buildings, and we've noted the heights. You'll notice that there are 30, 50-meter heights. We're requesting 23 meters for an additional floor of self-storage, separated from that community by existing buildings that are also zoned 18 meters, for instance, or 22 meters if you start looking towards the north. The envelopes are maximum envelopes. They're to position. This committee has a responsibility to both look at the existing context and the planned function and decide if it's appropriate. The second item is the retail. Now I'm going to steal from Bliss. The retail component was also raised by the community. It's why we have Chris Gordon here. It was raised that it might create an uncomfortable amount of traffic on Industrial Avenue. It's a 4-lane undivided arterial roadway intended to service one of the city's larger employment areas in proximity to an interchange. The road is well suited to accommodate the additional traffic. The variance for the height has no real impacts in terms of traffic. The additional retail is recognizing that there's a regional shopping center just a couple of properties removed from this. There are obvious synergies between the retail proposed at Diamond and the retail at the regional shopping center. And to be perfectly honest, it's in keeping with the direction of OPA 180. 180 says, you know what, you can introduce some accessory retail, and it should be in the area of 750 square meters, which is exactly what the applicant is asking for. And to be honest, it's long overdue, in that we spend a lot of time crafting traditional Main Street policies and arterial Main Street policies, and we should be crafting policies just like this that make employment areas better places to work in. People shouldn't have to drive that far to go to a restaurant or pick up dry cleaning. That's exactly why this retail is proposed. So while we met with the community association and attempted to resolve their issues, I'm sorry, but we were not in agreement as to the impacts to the additional floor, and we disagree on the importance of bringing retail onto Industrial Avenue. If the community really does want Industrial Avenue to be something better, this is a good way to start. So those are my comments.
Bliss, do you have anything to say?
No, I think he said everything.
Chris, any comments on traffic or anything related to a Diamond? How many Diamonds are open now in Ottawa?
There are 8 open, and the 9th, Lincoln Field is under construction.
And how many more do you plan?
Our total build-out is 20, and we have this one. We have a proposal in at Clyde, and we've just submitted a proposal in at McGarry Terrace. So the 4 that we have in planning right now, there'll be an additional 6 on the way.
Okay. Are they all on arterial roads?
Yeah, so our criteria for when we look at sites is traffic of over 30,000 cars a day.
30,000?
Yep.
Chris Gordon?
Thank you, Madam Chair, which is a good segue into the gentleman who was speaking before, talking about the cumulative impacts. So I can speak to the impact of transportation. We've studied I think all of the Diamond locations in Ottawa, as well as we probably are looking at 10 or more in the GTA right now. And I can say that through a lot of the proxy counts, because there's no theoretical way to be able to go and understand what a site like this generates, other than to be able to go and use the examples that currently exist. And as Miguel, Mr. Tremblay mentioned, we typically get less than 30 trips a day, which means that as we take a look at the peak hours, we might get 2-3 trips. So it really is kind of a benign use from a transportation point of view, which is why when they are located at intersections of arterial roads, the impact really is just about access. It's not about the additional car traffic that's added to the network. And so basically that's the message based on our proxy counts and our experience with the site so far. The ability to locate a site like this here, in my mind, has very little impact to the transportation network. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions for Chris specifically, or you have some questions Councillor Cloutier has questions. Councillor Shirelli has questions. Cloutier? Councillor Cloutier?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation, Miguel and Bliss and Chris. Miguel and Bliss, thank you for meeting with the community and myself last Wednesday. Appreciate it very much. And just to make the point, I think the use of a diamond storage in this location is absolutely appropriate. There is no question about that. The issue is with, Miguel, you talked about it, two issues, the retail and the height. So let me start with the retail, if you will. Bliss, at the meeting last Wednesday, you said that storage and selling storage space is the prime business. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And you said that Coventry is full and you could build another Coventry anytime and fill it up.
Yes, that's correct. Diamond, through you, Madam Chair, Diamond is 100% full in the City of Ottawa, effectively.
Okay. So why, in the context of retail, why 700, and let me just clarify, the proponent is asking for 750 square meters of additional retail in addition to 350 square meters that would be of diamond use. Is that correct?
Through you, Madam Chair. If you've been into a diamond facility, every diamond facility has what we call a diamond reception area. It's where it's the front door to the facility. It's where you would go in and you would sign up for your unit.
Right, and sell boxes and other ancillary. So this is completely separate retail.
Yeah, yes, through you, Madam Chair. We are seeking an amendment to add, to allow for a third-party retailer.
Right.
Do all? Yeah.
They do have them, yes.
Yeah.
They do have?
Retail.
In some stores, not all of them.
No, but they do have in some.
Absolutely.
I thought you were looking at me, so that's why I asked.
No, you were talking, so I was looking at you, Chair.
Oh, thank you.
So the business is not dependent on having retail.
It's part of the business plan.
One of the things that Diamond prides itself on is being safe, secure, and its brand. So part of our brand is having nice places to go and attractive locations for our residents and for our community to be proud of and to attend. People want to attend the Diamond facility. So one of the things that we've strived to do over the last, since I've been at Diamond, is to really animate the ground floors. To not just be a blank ground floor. Greenbank is an example. There's not any third-party retailer at Greenbank, but I would argue that our Bank Street location, South Keys, is a nice ground floor. There's a third-party retailer and it animates the ground floor. We require very little parking. So, 5 to 7 parking spaces is all that Diamond requires. So we can take that added density, put it on top of a retailer where you typically wouldn't get density from a big box retailer because we don't require any parking, and we can animate that ground floor and make it more attractive from a streetscape, from driving by for the community.
Yeah. Bliss, you are right. You have an outstanding business model. I'm a client of Diamond on Walkley Road. There is no retail there other than the Diamond proper, and it's very safe on Walkley Road. So I don't accept that for safety the retail is required in that location, but you're noted. How many sites have retail? Of your 9, you said 9 in Ottawa?
Yeah, Bank Street, Innis, Lincoln Field, Carling.
Okay.
Barhaven.
Barhaven will. Our Canada site, which is adjacent to the Canadian Tire, we had out parcels that we built, that are retail out parcels.
Innis Latier.
In it, yeah. So 5 of the 9.
How many sites are, this is a quarter acre. How many sites are a quarter acre that you put your buildings on?
What was your question, sir?
It's 0.28 of an acre, this site.
So you're asking how many are on such a tight spot?
On such a small, compact
So
site.
the largest self-storage facility in Ottawa is the Canada one. It's 240,000 square feet. That's on 2 acres. Everything else is less than an acre or about an acre.
And this one is on, what is the size of this?
1.7, I think. I don't know.
0.28 hectares, yes, 0.28 hectares.
Almost 2 acres.
Okay. And this one is approximately 167,000 square feet. Is that?
Yes, 150,000 square meters, roughly, yes.
Okay.
Or,
I'll have some questions. I should not ask questions to staff now, Chair. I should finish up with FOTEN.
Absolutely, because who else, I forget now, Councillor Shirelli, you want questions too? Yes, so we'll ask our questions of FOTEN and Ms. Edwards, who is not FOTEN. Okay, good.
Okay,
so
I'll
you finish it up, please.
Got it. With regard to the retail, and Chris, perhaps you can, the transportation study was in January 2017 in January, and it talks about 60 trips per day. Mr. Tremblay talked about 24 trips. The other 36 related to the storage business. The other 36 would be related to the retail?
No, the 24 trips that Mr. Tremblay was discussing, I think, is kind of a nominal value for some of the sites that we've seen in Ottawa. Based on some of the additional proxy count information, so we've worked at generalizing kind of the impact and the impact of one of these sites with retail. So, for example, we certainly use and refer to the one on Bank Street with the sports store associated with it. So at the end of the day, call it 30 trips, 30 one-way trips, meaning 60 in total over a 24-hour period. And what that really means in terms of what we want to analyze being peak hour trips is down into the 5, 6, and that's for the entire site. So no, we're not separating Diamond from the additional retail. That's all together.
All together in those 60 trips.
Correct.
Okay.
And can I add a comment related to that? In terms of the synergy between the third-party retail, the Diamond retail, and the Diamond self-storage, all of the loading facilities are integrated together. So unlike what you see right now on Industrial Avenue, where it's actually the National Grocer has their loading fronting onto and has about, if I have to guess, 10 loading bays fronting onto Industrial Avenue. The intent here is a high-quality building that acknowledges that retail is, again, in keeping with the policy direction of OPA 180 and is reasonable in employment areas, but doing it in a way that's very good. The Industrial Avenue is not a design priority area. It was not subject to UDRP, but we took all of the principles that we've learned from the other sites that are subject to UDRP, including some of the lessons learned at the recent Carling site, to bring it onto this site. And without damaging anything, I think this is probably the best light industrial building that will be here in terms of meeting some of the city's design objectives. And part of that is doing it with a little bit more height that has no noticeable impacts on any industrial properties, and surely none of the residential properties that are over 200 meters away.
I acknowledge that the design and look of your building is part of the marketing. I'm fine with that. In terms of the height, you have about a 65.
Yes. With all due respect,
Yeah.
I mean, normally we have 5 minutes for questions and that sort of thing. So I find, well, one of the other councillors was asking as well, should I move a point of order? So can you actually get to just...
Okay, one more point to FOTEN on the height. You have about a 65% ratio coverage on the site, and you could go bigger. Other locations have a lower profile and a bit larger property. Did you explore a different design where you could lower the height to be compliant with the current zoning and still attain the what you call the sales and design objectives, the sales objectives of Diamond?
So we did. We looked at numerous scenarios, as we always do for Diamond, because there are certain common elements to Diamond, but generally they are flexible on the building footprint. The area of asphalt, and we did flush this out with staff as well, is a function of truck movements and everything else. So to refine your comment, no, we couldn't go any bigger on the ground floor without exceeding the 65%, which is the maximum percentage of building coverage in the IL zone, nor would we want to, because you'll notice at the back of the property, those hatched areas are a depressed loading area. So you need a certain amount of vehicle turnaround, you need fire lanes, you need, as a matter of fact, we're reducing some of the drive aisles to increase some of the area of the landscaping abutting properties, which even though they're industrial properties, we can assume that they will redevelop over time. So essentially, the building footprint is as large as it should be on the site to achieve all of the other design requirements and the other functional requirements. But there is an opportunity here, and it's not as simple as it was characterized earlier. If you have an opportunity to intensify industrial properties, employment properties to meet some of your city's objectives, you should, providing there are no impacts to that increased intensity. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Blais is going to go ahead of Councillor Shirley because he has a question of the applicant, but I want Mr. Smith to talk a little bit about the recent employment land study that was done and what you hope to achieve and the goals you had.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So one of the things that flowed out of appeals that were received to Official Plan Amendment 150 was the need to complete our employment land study. And that was really taking a look at the supply and the demand, projecting that out and understanding what are the needs for the City of Ottawa in terms of continuing to accommodate employment uses within lands designated for employment use. And through that exercise, we clearly recognized that there was an opportunity to release some lands from employment use, but we were really at a very tight line between lands that were available for employment use and how much we could release for non-employment use. And where we have opportunities to intensify, and there was always a recognition that the numbers of employees that are accommodated within employment lands can vary, and if there are opportunities to intensify, that is a good thing, particularly in areas that really are designated and identified as key employment areas, unlike some other areas which one might arguably say don't necessarily fall within that category. So from the perspective of the employment land study, minor increases in opportunities is something that's very much in line with what was anticipated and expected.
Thank you. Councillor Blais.
Thanks very much. In talking to Councillor Cloutier and then just listening to the presenter, I think one of the fears is about, I don't actually think the fear is about height. I think the fear is about what this might do in terms of leading to further redevelopments down the road and wanting to avoid turning industrial into a Hunt Club or an Innes Road or a Maryville or something like that. And so I'm wondering, and the Diamond in New Orleans is great. The Innes Road's a beautiful building. It's got a sports store on the first floor, which is great. The one thing I don't like about the Innes Road building, and I see it reflected in your site plan, is the 2 stacks of parking between the sidewalk and the frontage of the building. And I'm wondering, to alleviate the concern raised by the councillor and the neighbor, could you bring the building closer to the sidewalk to create that pedestrian-friendly environment? I can't remember your name, I'm sorry, madam, but that list that you were speaking of earlier, and relocate the parking to other portions of the property, and that might help avoid that awkward situation that we see on some of our arterial commercial streets that is really what draws people away from them. No one walks on Innes Road. I doubt very much people walk on Hunt Club, and I doubt people will walk on Industrial. If the building is actually closer to the sidewalk, then perhaps they might actually start to do that. So not reduce the park, maybe you can lose a couple, but bring the building to the front and relocate the parking to other spots.
Maybe I can start, and Chris will speak to maybe a little bit more of the technical constraints. Having done quite a few of these, there are positional issues related to the building, and in particular the drive-through component. which is oriented always towards the arterial, and there's certain minimum setbacks so that there's an adequate throat length between the back of curb and the front of the building, so there's no queuing potential on the arterial. We did look at various scenarios. That's not to say that Industrial Avenue is less important than other streets, but it's certainly a different function than Carling Avenue or Innes Road that has certain additional design expectations. What we've done here is actually almost identical treatment to the 1840 Walkley Road, where it is double loaded, which is the one that the councillor is most familiar with, is still double loaded parking but supplemented with landscaping. So part of our exercise here was to reduce some of the drive aisles to add landscaping in certain strategic areas, so that recognizing that the building is 24 meters back, it's well landscaped and is a reasonable transition back to Industrial Avenue. Funny enough, when we did the public meeting, the main concern with the building height was that Industrial Avenue, as a result of this application and subsequent applications, would be a canyon effect, that there would be too much frontage and too much building, which we didn't agree with, and we think the proportions are right on a 40-meter wide arterial roadway, but it's a balance of getting the throat lengths, and Chris, I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more, but the throat lengths that the city wants, and to be honest, parking in reasonable proximity to that front-facing retail.
So just to quickly add through the chairs is that when we are designing the sites and helping with that, we do pay particular attention to the private approach bylaw, but also the TAC guidelines, and our design vehicle, in fact, is what we call the WB20, which is a tractor trailer. While only one every 2 weeks is what arrives at a Diamond self-storage on average, we still have to make sure that that vehicle can travel through the site. So when we combine all of those elements together, this tends to be the arrangement that works best, and also considering things like accessibility and proximity of things like accessible parking spaces to the front doors of the site. So again, when we compound all of those needs, this tends to be the arrangement that works out best for us.
Sure. I guess where there's a will, there's a way. And if you're applying for an amendment to the zoning bylaw, you can apply for variances to the private approach bylaw or other restrictions that might apply. I think it's just all in what you want to do. I know the Innes Road one, the door to the retail is actually on the side of the building. It's not on the frontage of the building.
Well, they have a lot of businesses here, and I think they're not all the same, but they all have a certain look to them, right? They all have the windows that look up, they have window dressings, they have commonality amongst them all, but it's like the Catholic School Board, which you used to be a trustee for. They use the same plan, but every one of them really looks different.
They improve it every time. They take the lessons you have to know.
Well, there you go. Thank you. Councillor Chiarelli. Why you wanted to, oh, you wanted to talk to staff, eh? Okay, anybody else want to talk to the proponent? No? Thank you for coming out today. So, Councillor Chiarelli.
Yeah, thank you. I know we have referred to staff, we've asked for a report dealing with including zoning for diamond-type facilities on all arterial Main Street zonings, right? We have a report that we're expecting from you? No? We deferred consideration on Clyde for that. Are we still getting that report?
Sorry, Councillor, can you repeat the question?
Okay. Do we have a report coming from staff on including this type of zoning in various types of zonings like arterial Main Street?
We have a report that's going to be coming forward that's going to be dealing with some light industrial type uses that would be permitted along main streets.
Okay, but it would permit this, right?
Well, this isn't a Main Street, but it could,
I know.
it could be something that could be included on Main Streets. We haven't concluded that, but that is a report that will be coming forward, yes. And it was focused on light industrial type uses that can appropriately locate on various main streets, both traditional and arterial, recognizing that we do have some light industrial activity that works well in those contexts in association with retail.
So that's the reason the Clyde issue isn't at committee yet?
I can't speak on the Clyde issue where that's at. I know there was an application that was submitted, and I don't recall. I thought that was dealt with previously by committee and council.
Then are we, will we be including this zoning for this type of facility in all industrial zones as well? Is that going to be part of a different report, or will there be such a report?
So this type of facility is in fact permitted in industrial zones today. What's being asked for in this instance is a small retail, which is also allowed for within the framework of the official plan. And we have a consistency implementation that we will be doing once we get final approval of OPA 180 through the OMB process.
So ultimately, the combined use will be allowed in industrial zones. Is that right?
Yes, there is an opportunity for small-scale ancillary type uses that would be up to 750 square meters. In this instance, they're asking for the retail component, and we'll have to take a look and see how far we go with that.
So that what I'm trying to get is, at some point, is it true that at some point this type of application would probably never make it to committee because it would just be included? If committee approves the,
Again, we're not at the point yet with moving forward on the changes to the industrial zoning that flow from OPA 180 because we have not yet received the final decision on OPA 180, and that's a process that we have yet to go through. As far as the light industrial on arterial and traditional main streets, that's something we're very much in process with, and the expectation is a report will be coming forward within the next couple of months on that.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Cloutier.
Thank you, Chair. Questions for staff? Merci, Jean-Charles. Merci de ta participation puis des réunions qu'on a eues. Just two questions. With regard to the retail, on page 5 of the report, you talk about OPA 180, policy 3.6.5.2, and it enumerates some uses. But it's a pretty broad category. Retail is not one of those uses. Why are you referring to, and they're asking for retail, why did you use that policy to justify this?
Madam Chair, while retail use is not specifically listed in the OP also does not specifically preclude it. Staff still feels that the intent of the OP is being met by being supportive of the employment area similar to other uses that are listed, such as convenience stores, restaurant, coffee shops, or similar uses.
Okay. But is retail not an enumerated section or segment? Is there not a segment, a policy that talks about retail that you could have referred to since the proponent is asking for retail? They are not asking for drugstores or coffee shops. As a matter of fact, they don't want restaurants, so they said, and I absolutely believe that. Could you not have referred to retail in your report?
Not sure where you're following the question. Retail isn't listed in that policy as noted. The request was for retail, and staff reviewed that, considering other uses that are listed were similar in impact, the size, they met the size criteria. That's why we supported it, or recommended support.
Okay, but this policy, as enumerated here, does not refer to retail.
That's correct.
Okay, is there a policy that refers to retail?
I think you've explained it. Now, both of you have explained it.
There's
So the
many
bottom line is
policies that
nothing
refer to retail, but in this context, no. I think I'm understanding your question.
What I'd like is the assurances in what we are approving that it will not be a restaurant in what might be approved by this committee, that it will not be a restaurant because it is not the intention of Diamond to have a restaurant or a coffee shop, but they have consistently spoken of the dry goods and the sporting goods.
Can I just ask for clarification? Because you started off, I think every question was why they would even allow to have retail, and now we're trying to define what kinds of retail. I'm just wondering what it is you want to have happen here. Retail or no retail?
So
that's what I'm not understanding.
The staff recommendation is to change the zoning bylaw to allow retail.
Yeah.
I do not support that.
Okay. I think we know that.
So that's what I'm asking about.
But you've asked it, and I think they've tried to come back.
The report, for my colleagues, the report appears to be inconsistent.
Because they said, say it again, Don.
In terms of the impacts and similar uses, although retail was not listed in that policy, the other uses like shoe repair, bank, restaurant, staff submit that the intent of the official plan is being met.
I understand. So all of those would be permitted.
They're not being requested. In this case, retail use is the only additional use being proposed.
And the report does not refer to retail. That's my...
Which report, sorry?
The report written by staff, page 5.
It does, actually, yes. Yeah.
Retail is an enumerated segment, and it was not referred to in the report.
I think staff have tried everything they can to try and, or anybody, maybe Mr. Smith, probably more than, because you're just going to keep asking, and they're going to keep telling, but you're not believing. So
help me understand.
So, Madam Chair, the current zoning does not allow a retail use at this location. The official plan sets out sort of the policies and the nature of uses that would be considered appropriate within an employment area, and it identifies small-scale, non-industrial uses, and some of those are identified in the report as being within the scope of what could be considered reasonable within an industrial area. So that's a policy in the official plan. That policy does not make specific reference to retail, either saying yes or no. We are dealing with a rezoning. I think what Mr. Herwire is indicating is that the assessment of that retail was within the framework of the official plan policies that allows for non-employment type uses, ancillary type uses to exist within industrial zones where they don't diminish or take away from the opportunities for employment potential to be realized, and to allow for some support uses to be provided within those areas. And in this instance, the retail is specifically being added to the zoning to allow for that type of activity to occur on this property, and that's it.
Okay. The zoning is, I recognize the recommendation is to add retail. That's what the zoning recommendation is. It's not what the report talks about. That's my point.
I think the report...
Yes, it does. So, the report does tell you. That's the recommendation, that you have X number, that it is what it is. It has the stories, it has the retail. That's the recommendation the staff put forward.
Just one last question to staff. A pretty broad statement at the top of page 5. The requested zoning bylaw amendment seeks to address various zoning provisions in order to support the development of the site as a self-storage business. Jean-Charles, if you could elaborate on that, because the retail being asked for is said to be ancillary, but Bliss has said that it is not required as part of the self-storage business. Why is a statement like that is delivered in such a facile way in the report? How does retail or additional height, why is it required to support the self-storage business?
I don't think that I wrote that it's required to support. So I'd ask you to specify.
I'll take a chance.
Just beginning of paragraph 2 on page 5.
Yeah, so that's referring to various provisions being amended to support the self-storage, and that wasn't, if that was read to indicate that the retail is required to support the self-service storage business. That's not the intent. If you go to the details of the zoning, there's various relief in terms of setbacks, aisle widths, loading. That's what that section is about.
Height and retail.
Okay, that does not pertain to that issue. It's the zone provisions, setbacks, and
Okay, so the requested zoning bylaw amendment is not required to support the self-storage business of height and retail. Is that correct? Is that
right? It says it seeks to address various zone provisions in order to support the self-storage, and those zone provisions are detailed. It's not related to the height and the retail.
Okay, but height and retail are part of the zoning bylaw amendments that are being proposed.
They're one part
in this report.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. As
Does anyone else want to speak?
You might be, Madam Chair. It's an important point.
10 times, but okay. Anybody else want to talk? Councillor Nussbaum, do you want to talk? Okay, and you don't get to talk or vote. Lucky you. All right, did you want yeas and nays?
I have a motion to...
I know. You have a motion.
Two motions.
Sure. Why don't you introduce those now?
Thank you.
And just a minute, we don't have any technical on this one, do we? Okay.
So the first motion, and I believe it's been circulated, Melody, has it been circulated, or should I read it? Whereas the proposed building height is 23 meters, and whereas the proposed building is considerably taller than the existing one and two-story buildings immediately surrounding the site, and whereas the desired height is 18 meters, therefore be it resolved that the height of the building be limited to 18 meters, and be it further resolved that there be no further notice pursuant to subsection 3417 of the Planning Act. Do you want me to do the second motion now, Chair?
I just have a question for you on the word desired. Who's desired? Your desired, or
desired and being respectful as the current zoning.
Yeah, I noticed in the last motion that with Councillor Brockington, they used that word, and it's not something that's usually used. So that's what I'm just asking for clarification. Okay, so basically you're saying you don't want it to be 23 meters, you want it to be 18 meters.
Yes, please.
Okay, number two.
Number two is like
Separate the vote, right?
Brockington separating out the report recommendations, and I won't read it all, but we would be voting on the report
not having retail
separately, so with regard to height and then with regard to retail.
So in that case, Mr. Mark, are you still there?
I am, Madam Chair.
Okay, so does that make the separation of the vote on the retail go first, because wouldn't the height be impacted by the taking away of the retail, because currently on the bottom floor is not where stuff is stored, it is where people drive in and pick up boxes maybe and all that retail stuff that they do right now, right? Because you do have a retail component right now. So my question is, what's the order?
Madam Chair, it seemed to me, but of course the Chair will have the final determination, that it made sense that the height motion would go first, because that would affect the second motion in its clause. Again, I don't have the motions in front of me, but as I recall, the first clause in the second motion deals with height, and so it would effectively be amended by the first motion, Madam Chair.
All right, so we're going with the height first. So the first one is to reduce the height from 23 meters to 18 meters. So on that, we've asked, Councillor Cloutier has asked for yeas and nays. Councillor Blais? No. Councillor Brockington?
No.
Councillor Chiarelli? Yes. Councillor Cloutier?
Yes.
Councillor Leeper?
No.
Councillor Nussbaum?
No.
Councillor Kadri?
No.
Vice Chair Tierney?
No.
And myself, no. So now we'll separate. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 to 2. So on the next motion, we will vote on whether there should be a retail use permitted. Does that make sense?
Correct, because, well, I think we need to vote that the height is being accepted, and...
Well, the height has been accepted, so now your motion...
The motion was to reduce the height.
Yes, I know. And it lost 7 to 2. So now you asked to separate it so that you can vote on the retail component separately, right?
Okay.
So we'll vote on the retail component, whether or not to allow retail at this location of this application. So, Councillor Blais?
Just to confirm, yes yes is to allow retail? It's not some kind of counter-negative?
No, I'm not that deep today.
Yes.
I can promise you, after today, I'm not that deep.
Yes.
Stay where I am. No, it's not a double negative. Councillor Brockington to allow retail at that location.
Yes.
Councillor Shirelli? Councillor Cluche?
No.
Councillor Leeper?
Yes.
Councillor Nussbaum?
Yes.
Councillor Kadri?
Yes.
Vice Chair Tierney?
Yes.
Myself, yes. So then, I don't have any technical, we're not moving anything else, so,
Chair, you need to carry the balance of the motion.
yeah, that's what I was just going. So on the balance of the motion, which is the balance,
Height and other zoning.
do we need yeas and nays on that, or do you just want to dissent?
I'll dissent.
Okay. Would you like to dissent too? Okay, so one dissent. Thank you. As amended, so, no, it wasn't amended. So it wasn't amended, so I don't have to do as amended. Perfectly. Thank you. Bylaw. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 speakers on that. First up is Mike Wesley.
Toby, you stick around?
Well, somebody has to stick around beside me. All right. Hello, sir.
Madam
Thank
Chair.
you for coming out today,
Thank you.
and thank you for your submission.
Well, yeah, it's been changed a little bit.
Oh, you changed it?
Well, yeah, I've had new
Information?
information with this natural heritage overlay that I never knew anything about. So
And
that's,
how did you find that out? From being here today?
no, just about a week ago, I was talking
Okay.
with Amy McPherson, and
Well, I appreciate that you sent in your submission ahead of time. And so go ahead, sir. You have 5 minutes to present.
thank you. Yeah, my name's Mike Wesley. I'm Vice President of the Goulburn Landowners Group Incorporated. Anyway, my wife and I are opposed to this site alteration and bylaw and the new natural heritage designation put on our property, as it is unconstitutional and goes against our rights as private property owners to own, enjoy, and prosper as we see fit. It is an expropriation, that is, control of and a limitation to the right to use and the right to the enjoyment of our property without compensation. We have owned our 10-acre general rural property for 48 years and are sick and tired of municipal government interference into our lives over our property, which we own outright. We have our Crown Land Patent Grant of 1824 and a clean title deed in our names only. Our first issue was in 1970. We moved a 60 by 12 mobile home onto our property with a no trailer bylaw coming in or in the air by the township. Our second problem was in 73. We wanted to replace our trailer with a house. Goulburn Township said, I must be a farmer before they issued me with a building permit. Defeated. In 1987, I had a petition created to have the Hobbs Municipal Drain Extension constructed to provide outlet for water directed to our area, causing flooding. My neighbors and I spent big money to get rid of other people's water. We did the township job for them. Drainage here is another issue, still being abused. In 1996, a mineral extraction reserve designation was put on our properties. Dent Page and Andrew Hope, official planners for the township and the region, said it was a done deal. Aggregate was needed for the expansion of Highway 7. I told them they should have included the aggregate owners to their behind closed door meetings and over my dead body where they have my land. I took Carol Christensen for a ride around the MXR intended block. Her words were, "Oh my God, the official planners haven't done their homework. There are people living out here." 2.5 years later, the exercise was defeated at 111 Lisgar Street in front of the Regional Council. At that time, there was no natural heritage features worth saving. There is even less now. Trees are all dying, ash trees. In 2005, I battled a corrupt PSW, provincially significant wetland designation, initiated by the City of Ottawa on our property. The cost was enormous. 3 years of lost sleep, depression, anxiety, stress, causing me a heart attack. All this for biodiversity offset, cut and fill. They wish to designate our properties to replace real provincially significant wetlands given to developers in the area. That is your Brown's Independent Grocer, Tim Hortons, Jackson Trails, etc., Phoenix Homes. On October 22nd, M&R removed, I invited M&R to our property, and on October 22nd, M&R removed the provincially significant wetland designation. It had rubber stamp for the city. Biologist report. M&R told the city to remove the PSW designation from the official plan. In 2016, a stormwater runoff tax. I attended 4 meetings and spoke in front of the Environment Committee at City Hall, stating I have no stormwater runoff into city ditches. City water runs onto our properties in the spring runoff. We already paid for a municipal drain, so this is double dipping by the city. We still have drainage problems in our area. No adequate outlets. Municipal Act, a single 10-11-2, paragraph A4. A single-tier municipality may pass bylaws respecting following matters. Public assets of the municipality acquired for the purpose of exercising its authority under this or any other act. 2, Tinney Township Council, Howland and Graydon Ebert from Gowlings, WLD law firm, formerly Gowling, Lafleur, Henderson. Municipalities are placing strict regulations of development prohibition of uses in official plans and states that these measures are beyond the legal authority of municipalities. Municipalities have used or continue to use their official plans to regulate or prohibit specific land uses should discontinue this planning policy approach. It is clear that the law, both the decided case law and the Planning Act, does not give the authority to use their official plans for the purpose, and that doing so constitutes a bridge too far in the use of official plans. Should they continue to do so, they will no doubt be met with opposition from interested members of the public or property owners with the law on their side.
Sir, you've used up your 5 minutes.
No.
Yeah, you have, but maybe somebody will ask you a question. Councillor Shirelli will. Don't. Ask a specific question.
Okay, I was going to ask him to detail the things he discussed with me in our meeting.
So what have you not said without reading it?
Well, the only thing is going to be the enforcement of this site and alteration bylaw upon owners of private land will be considered a misfeasance in public office, and at the least, and a violation of the criminal code at the worst. I'll just read this one thing and I'll shut it off.
No, no, thank you.
Okay.
But thank you for coming out today. Anyone have any questions? Councillor Kadri?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just a question back to the delegation. You mentioned in your last statement something about criminal activity or criminal...
This is stuff I've derived from research that I've got, that the city is, the city, you don't have the authority nor the jurisdiction to make rules and regulations on my land without my consent.
Madam Chair, could I ask our legal to
Yes, you
comment
can.
on that, please?
Madam Chair, I have in front of me a decision of the Ontario Superior Court dealing with this argument. And so if I may read 2 paragraphs?
Sure.
I do not agree with the applicant's interpretation of powers of a municipality or the significance of a Crown patent. The Crown patent is an instrument by which land is conveyed by the Crown to a private individual or members of the public. Crown patents are found all over the province of Ontario. There is nothing in the conveyance from the Crown which prevents properly enacted provincial legislation or suggests that a Crown patent has paramountcy over a municipality's ability to regulate private property. So the proposition is not well-founded, Madam Chair.
Okay. Did I answer your question?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Can I reiterate to the Crown patent grant?
No, sir, you can't.
Okay.
Thank you, though. I try to be the only way I can keep any kind of normalcy around here is by sticking to the same rules. And it's not easy on any day, really. If I don't have that to hang my hat on, I don't know where I go. Paul Joannis from Green Space Alliance, and then Murray Chown, and then Sheila Perry. And all of you I know that you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm here on behalf of the Green Space Alliance. We've worked closely with stakeholders, engaging with city staff over the whole process of crafting this bylaw. Staff report makes reference to this and also characterizes our position on the outcome. But I'd like to make the following submissions regarding the draft submitted for consideration by Planning Committee. So first, we're happy to see and strongly support the alteration bylaw. We're happy that the bylaw covers both rural and urban site alteration, and especially that it covers vegetation removal as a type of alteration to be covered by the restrictions of the bylaw or the provisions of the bylaw. On the downside, we would have preferred to see the bylaw enforce a permit system rather than the complaint procedure. We understand that a permit system might be more onerous, and especially in rural areas, it's of unknown effectiveness, really. However, we would be the only municipality in Ontario with the site alteration bylaw that does not include a permit system, so kind of stands out from the rest of the practice in the province. Now, if it's not possible to introduce a permit system, perhaps a minimal form of prior reporting could be introduced, sort of as an adjunct to the complaint procedure. So we would propose that at a minimum, the bylaw require that the ward councillor be notified of any intended site alteration meeting the bylaw definition. This would at least raise a flag ahead of time and not place the burden of enforcement on post hoc complaints reported to the city by the 311 number. So that's our first point. Second point, from a green space perspective, our interest is mostly in preventing unnecessary vegetation removal, and in particular wooded areas, woodlands, trees. In this respect, we're pleased to see that in Article 10.1 of the bylaw, that site alterations that are in the proximity of sensitive environmental areas will require prior approval of the General Manager of Planning, Infrastructure and Economic Development. However, we question whether the proposed distance of the site alteration to the significant environmental area of 30 meters is sufficient. We note that in similar policies in the current official plan, the limit is set at 120 meters of site alterations in the proximity of significant wetlands, and also at 120 meters with respect to site alterations and development in proximity to natural environment areas. So we believe that the provision of the site alteration bylaw should be consistent with the official plan policies in this regard, and propose that the distance be changed from 30 meters to 120 meters. The third point we made deals with the coverage of the site alteration bylaw. As currently drafted, it doesn't cover a type of vegetation removal that is one of our highest concerns, and that's the preemptive cutting of rural trees and woodlands ahead of urban expansions. This is the kind of problem we've seen pop up before, where there's a potential urban expansion, landowners clear the land to make the property more attractive for development. And then there's a subsequent loss of green space and woodlots and woodlands. So what we found with the current way that the bylaw is currently drafted, it only covers protection for vegetation removal in the close peri-urban area. So we're not concerned about the far rural areas. We're just concerned about that area that is immediately adjacent to the urban boundary. So all of those lots that are really, in a sense, they're rural, but at the same time, we all know that one day they'll be urban. Any future expansion, these are the first lots that are likely to be brought in. Right now, unless the woodland area in this crown of land is considered already in the natural heritage system of the city as significant, that would be protected by this bylaw, the way that it's drafted. But that's only really major pieces of green space. There are any number of smaller woodlots, wooded areas that would sort of fall through the filter and not be covered by anything right now. Not by the urban tree conservation bylaw, because that's only urban. Not by the significant woodland policy recently approved, because that deals really explicitly with urban expansion areas, those that are already identified as future urban expansions, and not by the site alteration bylaw as currently drafted. So it's a gap in the policy coverage, and it's really good planning from our perspective to protect these woodlots that aren't significant from a rural perspective, don't meet the criteria for rural significance.
You know that the 5 minutes has gone now.
I'll just finish right now, but would meet the criteria for urban significance. So on that basis, we're hoping that one of these three instruments, whether
Thank
this
you very
bylaw...
much.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone have any questions? Councillor Nussbaum?
Sort of a question to staff flowing from the
Anybody have,
delegation.
for Mr. Johannes? Councillor Leeper, and then...
Paul, I think you've been heavily involved in the creation of this bylaw. There's been a lot of consultations. Do you have any indication of why the bylaw would set out a 30-meter distance from those sensitive areas versus the 120 meters that's in the OP?
I don't have a lot of insight into that particular question. I haven't, it really didn't come up in our discussions previous. I had just a few words before the meeting today, but I think staff would be in a better position to respond to that than I would.
Okay, and then with respect to the preemptive clearing of woodlots in those, I think you call them peri-urban areas, those are immediately adjacent to the urban boundary, is that a real problem?
Yeah, I think there are specific examples of this type of situation that has occurred ahead of OPA 76 in 2009, 2010. It's in fact a problem that was already identified in the significant woodland policy work, and when Council approved the significant woodland policy last year, it also directed staff to set up a working group to deal with the implementation provisions of that policy, including the treatment of preemptive clearing in the peri-urban area. The reason I bring it up today is that the work in that working group, and I'm a member of that working group, at this point seems to defer to the site alteration bylaw. But if we only rely on the site alteration bylaw, it won't cover these smaller woodlots that would not be covered, that aren't currently part of the natural heritage system.
So there is a gap that you feel we still have work to do to cover?
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Just off the top of my head, thank you very much, Mr. Johannes. Thank you. Mr. Smith, I mean, we're talking about, I don't know where the hole would be, okay? But one of the concerns that Mr. Johannes had was specifically to the land immediately around a suburban community. But in the last few years, we've approved the woodlot, the wildlife, site altercation, tree preservation, I'm missing a couple, plus some things specific to the wetlands. I mean, what do you think that we're missing, and why would you not, or are you planning at some point to rationalize them and bring them back as one?
So thank you, Madam Chair. You're correct. There's been a lot of work that's going over the last little while, dealing with a number of issues, addressing the challenges around environmental lands, environmentally sensitive lands, woodlots, and so on. One of the key things that Council approved last year was the Urban Forest Management Plan, And one of the things that flowed from that, we've identified that as an item to do this year, initiate the work this year, is a review of the urban tree conservation bylaw, which is ongoing. And if there's a void or a gap or a hole, it's within the framework of that review that we would be looking to address. We don't really see the need in terms of this current site alteration bylaw, and we definitely recognize that there's more work that's flowing out of the urban forest management plan that will help to close some of the gaps if there are any gaps out there.
And why are you not recommending a permit? I know that you're going to have a 2-year report back, but why are you not, because the permit was raised?
We've never had a permit for site alteration. Well, we never had the site alteration bylaw. We had variations of forms of site alteration, so the topsoil removal that was part of the 4 municipalities, the drainage bylaw, which is an element of a site alteration. Moving into the permit process is an incredibly intensive exercise to go through. The experiences that we've had in site alteration is that, generally speaking, these are being undertaken in a responsible manner. There are some situations where we do have some issues that we encounter from time to time.
And what do you do then when, for example, you have a couple of bad apples? What do you do then?
Actions are taken if there's other initiatives that we can pursue, corrective measures or prosecutions under whatever legislations might be available. But at the end of the day, this is really to set a stage to identify best practices and accepted standards. It's not to penalize, it's to say this is what the expectations are when you're undertaking site alteration, and it's really within that framework that we don't see the need to move down the path of a permit process.
But do you ever see a checklist sort of thing that would bring them all together so that when you look at, you can look with one lens comprehensively at one site?
Typically, site alteration really, the bylaw is really focused around activities that occur outside of the normal development review process. If we're into a development review process, all these issues are comprehensively looked at that time. Sure. So this is really those situations where things might be occurring outside of a formal application process.
Preloading or something.
Exactly.
Like that. Yeah, and preloading, you know, around Barhaven, for example, you have to do that. So. Okay, you were next, and then questions of staff?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I guess a question for Ms. McPherson, just following up from Mr. Johannes's intervention. So first, on the third point he made, so he's not necessarily arguing that the site alteration bylaw should be the place, but is it true that currently for a woodlot less than 0.8 hectares on the edge of the urban boundary but not in the urban area, we don't have a regime to control or the demolition of that woodlot or the destruction of that woodlot if it's less than 0.8 hectares?
Through you, Madam Chair. The peri-urban woodlands that Mr. Johannes refers to, if they are as part of the city's natural heritage system in some way, shape, or form, if they are associated, for example, with a significant valley land, or if they form an identified linkage feature, and therefore appear on the schedules, then they would be protected under the current bylaw. It's not really a matter of the size of the woodlot in that case. Certainly, however, the urban significance criteria for significant woodlands is somewhat size dependent. So I believe Mr. Johannes's point is that a significant woodland in the rural area is generally larger than the threshold set for significance in the urban context. And so there may be some smaller woodlands that are not already identified as something else in our natural heritage system, which might qualify as significant woodlands in an urban context, but which are not part of that context as yet, and therefore would not be protected by the urban tree conservation bylaw in its current form, and would not be protected by this site alteration bylaw, which depends upon features being shown on Schedule L or designated in some official plan.
So in light of that, what in your opinion would be the appropriate for that issue to be addressed?
I concur with my manager, Mr. Smith, in saying that that is something that we could look at through the upcoming urban tree conservation bylaw review. Previously, that bylaw was amended to include designated urban expansion areas, and it seems like a reasonable avenue to pursue and to consult the city, the public, on the possibility of expanding to look at just beyond that boundary.
Okay, well, I mean, that sounds reasonable. We take that as staff direction that that will be something they will explore.
I'll have to ask Mr. Smith.
Sorry, Councillor.
And he was talking to Councillor Lieber.
Could you take it as staff direction to look at this issue in the context? We're not going to do it here, it sounds like. I accept that
what
as
issue?
part of the
Be
review.
Specific of the issue, please.
Well, the specific issue that Mr. Johannes read about the para-urban problem. So it doesn't sound like, it sounds like there may be a lacuna. We're not going to argue it here. In the context of the work you're doing on the significant woodlands policy and the urban tree bylaw work, which I understand is taking place this spring, we may, if there is a gap, then that would be the appropriate place to take that on, correct?
That's correct, and I indicated that we would be looking at it in the context of the review of the urban tree conservation bylaw. So as Ms. McPherson indicated, and as I indicated, that's something that very much is on the plate in terms of things we'll be reviewing.
Okay, great. My second question is relating to the bylaw itself. Under the interpretive clauses 3(9), it says that the bylaw applies to all lands within the geographic limits of the City of Ottawa, other than those areas which are subject to regulations made under Section 28(1) of the Conservation Authorities Act. And if you can't answer this question now, I'm happy to have the answer later. But is staff confident that all of the areas that the official plan anticipated as being covered under the 120-meter rule, are there currently regulations under the Conservation Authorities Act that capture those areas? Because Section 28(1) of the Conservation Authorities Act allows the Conservation Authority to establish regulations pertaining to specific land areas. And I just don't know, I don't have the knowledge to know whether or not that maps exactly the areas that the official plan in setting the 120-meter policy, say for significant wetlands. Do we know that there are regs under the Conservation Authorities Act that this provision of the interpretive clause applies to them?
Madam Chair, the regulations established by the conservation authorities do address significant wetlands that are designated in our plan, plus 120 meters around those wetlands. It is my understanding that there are some updates to the regulations mapping currently underway, given the recent change, for example, in the Mississippi Valley Conservation Authority's position on unevaluated wetlands. Those areas will also be taken under their jurisdiction shortly, well, they actually have taken jurisdiction over them, but the mapping has yet to be fully communicated to our staff and posted on our website. So that takes a very great amount of land that's considered part of the city's natural heritage system out of our jurisdiction under this bylaw. As to whether it includes all of the lands that would currently be captured, you mentioned the 120 meters, and I know you and I had discussed previously how the official plan does refer to an adjacency trigger distance to require an environmental impact statement for development or site alteration within 120 meters of a number of different natural features. The decision was made early on in the process of developing this bylaw to scope the application of that requirement in the bylaw, which is under the Municipal Act and not under the Planning Act, that we would only look at requiring environmental impact statements for work within 30 meters of natural heritage features and designated environmental areas. That decision was made for a number of reasons, primarily because works done outside of the 30 meters often have very little impact on a feature. The intervening distance is usually sufficient to ensure that there won't be impacts. We, of course, continue to review development applications within 120 meters of those features as specified in the official plan policies. In a number of cases, though, if the development is of a minor nature, the environmental impact statement may be waived by staff in those cases.
Okay,
so,
thank you, Amy.
Yeah.
I did have a couple more speakers. So before you ask more questions,
You want me to wait until the end?
I think so. Okay, so I just remembered I have 2 more speakers. Who else wants to ask questions besides Councillor Nussbaum? Okay. Murray Chown, and then Sheila Perry. And then we'll go back to staff. Been a long day, eh?
Fascinating day. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. It's late and my comments will be brief. I'm appearing this afternoon on behalf of the Greater Ottawa Home Builders Association. And I want to start by saying I think everybody around this table will probably appreciate that the home builders entered into this discussion with the city with great reservations in terms of where we might end up at the end of the day. But over the many months that staff have been working on this bylaw, I think they've gone to great lengths to reach out to all of the interest groups, including ourselves and Green Space and others who have an interest in how we are dealing with preparing sites for development. And I think that staff have done an excellent job of what I would call finding the middle ground between doing nothing, might have been the industry's first preference, and a far more rigorous bylaw that might require a permit system. I share the advice, or I agree with the advice that's been given to committee that a permit system is going to be time consuming, it's going to be expensive, it's going to take up staff resources, and let's give this a try. I think one of the important aspects of this report, as we've seen in many other reports to committee over the last few years, is that staff are recommending that they'll come back in 2 years with a report on how things are going. We certainly are optimistic that when they'll say things are going just fine. The last thing is just to support the comments that you've heard from Ms. McPherson in terms of the 30 meters versus the 120 meters that were brought up by Mr. Johannes. I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that the 120 meters in your official plan policies and in provincial policy guidelines is not a setback. It is simply an area where you're required to do studies if you're proposing development within the 120 meters. It's not a setback. The 30 meters is more realistically the recommendation that you will see time and time again out of environmental impact studies in terms of areas or setbacks that might be recommended from those natural features. So the 30-meter provision that's in the site alteration bylaw is very appropriate and reasonable. Subject to any questions from members of the committee, those are my submissions, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Leeper?
Marie, I don't think the question is one of setbacks, but back to that 30 meter versus 120 meter. The question is, why should we not be requiring or have the ability to require those environmental assessments when something is proposed within 30 versus 120?
And that opportunity will arise when the site develops through the formal development process. Okay. Thanks, Chair.
Can you just explain a bit more, because I can see that Councillor Leeper.
We are still going to have to do an EIS as part of a development application under the Planning Act, whether it's a site plan or a subdivision, or even at times a rezoning or official plan application. And at that time, the 120-meter trigger will take effect.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Murray. Sheila? Good afternoon. Whoops, careful.
There we are.
We were playing musical chairs earlier here.
Anyway, good afternoon, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. I'm representing as president the FCA, and discussions that we've had about this going back some time, and without going into what all the details, and I won't read exactly the full letter because it would take a bit of time, but I think I'd like to touch on, first of all, some of the things we like, some of the things we have still concerns about, and maybe a few suggestions. So first of all, we're quite pleased that the proposal covers both rural and urban. It includes removal of vegetation in the definition of site alteration, and that the identification of a 30-meter range, we see that that is part of the needs of prior approval, although the extent of or expansion of that is another element. At our last meeting last week, we had a number of whereas statements, and I hope that each of the councillors have that in front of them or that is shared. But what we did do is we looked at this as a working group, and we suggest the following, that if you do go forward with this bylaw, that a ward councillor must be notified of any intended site alteration. That's a huge part of that. The permit system, we still believe very strongly in that being required. And the city approval for any site alteration within 120 meters of any or otherwise protected area. And the whole notion of our membership being engaged in this discussion, I think, is really, really helpful. So when there are matters, as you're going through this next 2-year period, for example, these things will arise and engage us. We have associations across the city, and obviously with the urban and rural complexity, there's a lot to be done. The permit system, we feel strongly, helps regulate. We've seen this across the province. That's a huge issue, and I have had with Amy. We did talk about the notion of why we can't go that route, and the example given was it was just too costly to the city for staffing. But if we truly believe in the protection of these environmental areas, it's extremely important that we make every effort. So that I'm not convinced, nor are we convinced, about just a 311 call activating the follow-up. And I guess what will it take, bottom line, to have more staff support on this whole issue? A couple of suggestions along with this, and we've recently come through this with the mature neighborhoods, and this is a very interesting document, and I was very pleased to see the 10 principles, I believe, going as a background for this whole notion of site alteration. Those are great rules of thumb to follow, and we've currently actually, Mr. Willis knows about this, and I know Gobo, we've had this discussion about that message getting out to anybody doing an application. Similarly, can we do that as maybe a best practice? And it's just that great communication line. We all know neighborhoods that have strong community associations and planning groups, and they make that a high priority to have that engagement with the developers. We also know that there have been some practices, and how do we move away from that? Well, it's going to take a concerted effort by all of us. So I guess in summary, there are some things here certainly we really like, the principles. I toss out this as a mature neighborhood sort of maybe approach, going forward with very, very strong communications with the applicants and working together to review this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheila. Thanks for coming out today and hanging out as long as you did. Anybody have any questions for Ms. Perry? No, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
To Councillor Nussbaum, was it you? Was it you, Councillor Nussbaum, that had questions?
Yeah, thanks.
I
managed to get one of my questions answered on the side there. So I follow up on something Sheila mentioned, which I think was a good point. The 10 rules, guidelines in the report strike me as being highly reasonable. Maybe staff could outline how someone would know about them if they were planning to do site alteration. So what are going to be the communication techniques to make sure the word gets out?
Certainly. Madam Chair, the communications planned include brochures, which are in development now in the design stage, and they will be available at all of our client service centers, and our intent is to have them handed out with building permits and have the development information officers have a supply of those available to them to hand out to people coming in and asking questions. The information will all be available on the city's website on an ongoing basis. The city's bylaw section of the website already has a lot of good information about the other bylaws in the city and how they apply to residents. We will add a new page there to deal with this one. So we will have communications go to the public, and certainly we've had some very engaged stakeholders in this, and I would hope that those of them that support the bylaw would also help out on an voluntary basis to help spread the word as well through their networks.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Kadri. Question to Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And just, John, while you were speaking, I heard quite a bit about trees removal in terms of sanitation. What about drainage changes as well as grading changes, along with any soil being removed off a site?
So, Madam Chair, the site alteration incorporates the drainage bylaw. So the drainage bylaw and the provisions that were part of that are now included as part of the overall site alteration bylaw, as were the former topsoil removal bylaws of various former municipalities. So it's all covered off in here. In terms of the details, Ms. McPherson can definitely speak to the details, but it is all rolled together. So really what we're doing here is identifying the things that can occur and identifying the best practices when you're dealing with site alteration and setting out the basic rules that are expected to be met by those that undertake site alteration. In many instances, site alteration, particularly when you're dealing with development-related initiatives, is really part and parcel of the development application review, but there is some pre-work that happens on sites prior to formal applications coming in, and this basically sets the stage in terms of what the expectations are. It doesn't affect agricultural practices or quarry operations or normal things that would be associated with what a farmer would do with their land. Those things are all permitted, but it does speak to issues around drainage. So one of the things clearly is that you're not adversely impacting drainage from your property into natural drainage courses or flooding out your neighbor's property. So those things are all covered off comprehensively within this bylaw, rather than what we had previously, which was different bylaws dealing with different things. So this is pulling all of the pieces together.
Thank you for that, John. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Leeper, please.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of different questions. The first, with respect to taking a look at this issue in the urban areas, I just want to seek some assurance that while I have heard that it can be punted to the urban tree conservation bylaw review, that it will be considered in the scope of that review, given that I don't think we're talking about urban areas.
The urban tree conservation bylaw review is in the scope of the urban forest management plan, and I think there's some ability for us to take a look in possible expansion areas. So there is a means for us to take a look at that, and that's really what the purpose is. If there is a hole and a void that we need to take a look, we'll look at it through that process. Okay, so there's a lot of protections that are out there that have been put in place through the various things that have been happening, as Councillor Harder, Chair Harder has indicated, over the last couple of years.
Okay, I'm hearing about the potential for a problem. I'm not up to speed on whether or not it actually is, but I just want to make sure that if there is a real problem and we're punting to urban tree, that we are not going to be ruled out of scope if that's something we want to put on the review.
I think, Madam Chair, we'll be defining what the scope of that review will be.
Perfect. Thank you. And then with respect to this 30-meter, 120-meter, the answer that I've heard is that our official plan calls for an additional level of scrutiny when it's going to be altered within 120 meters of a natural or a sensitive area. This bylaw proposes 30 meters. There must be some reason, though, why the OP calls for 120, why that is considered the threshold at which we need to potentially scrutinize a bit more. Why is it now 30? I'm still struggling to understand that one. There's a good reason for it in the OP, I assume.
I think Madam Chairman and Ms. McPherson will step in if I'm misstating, but the provincial policy statement is the driver on that one. Provincial policy statement deals with matters that are dealt with under the Planning Act, drainage, or the site alteration bylaw, something that's not a municipal act. So there is the ability to define what makes sense, and in this instance, as Ms. McPherson indicated, and as Mr. Chown indicated, typically the area of greatest sensitivity is 30 meters from these natural features. So there will still be a requirement for a full impact assessment that would be done as part of a development application, but this is really setting the stage in terms of site alteration activities. And again, there's a lot of provisions in terms of best practices that are expected to be met. And the experience has been that generally speaking, when you're outside of that 30 meter, the concern clearly not the same, but it's really very much driven by the PPS, and it's the PPS that the official plan needs to be consistent with. Site alteration is not regulated under the PPS.
So I guess my last question sorry, there is the potential for alterations to occur outside of the context of a development review. How are we covering that?
That's what the site alteration bylaw is covering off. Okay. It's really more focused around things that are outside of development review, because anything that occurs within the framework of development review, it's dealt with within that process.
So between 30 meters and 120 meters away, what is that additional level of potential scrutiny to any alteration?
And I think, as indicated by Mr. Chown, it's not that you can't do things within 120 meters. It's you need to be very careful in terms of how you deal with it, and it really relates more to development activity within that 120 meter distance. Site alteration, yeah, it has implication in terms of the lands, but with the best practices that we're putting in place, experiences that we've had, the 30 meter in terms of being the area within which we would need a specific EIS undertaken. If that specific EIS identifies that it goes beyond the 30 meters, it will get picked up at that point.
Okay. And that will actually bring me to my last question, which is with respect to making sure, Councillor Nussbaum asked some questions around ensuring that there is awareness on that. I'm wondering how we can proactively reach out to landowners to maybe even ask them to give us a call before they undertake alteration, not for permits, but in order to give them an opportunity to find out about what the new site bylaw or site alteration bylaw says.
Well, with all due respect, they've been very engaged with the process, and I think it's different in the suburban areas. I know it's different in the suburban areas than it is in the urban areas. And
I'm thinking particularly about those rural. They all have been involved in this
process because, as Mr. Chown said, they were very concerned in the beginning that it would take them to the other side of,
Right.
He didn't say your words crazy, but it happened in the past with some of these things, and that's why I said, you've got so many different pieces that are all speaking to the same parcel of land, right? And it's like, how do you line them all up that they make sense?
Right.
Your office is aware when interest and within the urban boundary, all of interest, it's going to be happening very quickly. We're almost out of land in Barrhaven, so we know that. I know it. They know it. Why would they call up?
I'm looking at the potential for those individual landowners who are not developers, or just, again, encouraging people to give us a call when they're about to undertake site alteration to make sure that they understand the rules. And there's the
They understand it better than probably we do.
Well, certainly, I mean, Mr. Chown and the certainly would, and the larger builders, but there is the potential for smaller builders and non-land or non-developer landowners to have perhaps missed some of this conversation.
So, Madam Chair, again, there's going to be information will be posted online, information in terms of site alteration bylaws, the expectations associated with that. But really and truly, for the most part, this is really capturing best practices. And the experience that we have is, for the most part, those that are involved in preparing them for development, employ best practices. And this is a complaint-driven system that we're involved with here. We've got the whole monitoring system set up. We expect that we will actually have very good results coming out of that monitoring exercise, and I think it's just a matter of mapping things out. I mean, we have to recognize that we've been operating for many, many years without a site alteration bylaw that's trying to pull these things together.
Okay, and that's a 2-year monitoring process, or monitoring time?
That's correct, Madam Chair.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. So on item number 9, the site alteration bylaw, we don't have any motions on this one, right? Is it carried? Carried. Thank you. So the last item is the Councillor Kakish item. Repeal of bylaw number 2017-245, interim control bylaw, as it relates to the lands known municipally as 203 and 205 Henderson Avenue. We do have Mr. Weber here. Perhaps Councillor, well, I'll just I'll remind you that Councillor Tierney moved this as a notice of motion. So Councillor Fleury is the councillor for the area, and Councillor Kakish is the person's name on it. So do you want to go right to delegations?
Yeah, I mean, if I can give quick context, and then we can the public delegation. So just briefly, and it's all self-explanatory in the report. The applicant approached me a few months ago because he felt he was basically misled by the local councillor for the area with his application, and he's been working in good faith with the city for 3 years, I think, making certain modifications and changes to his property, and is impacted by the interim control bylaw, and never at any point am I aware of any urban councillors that support bunkhouses. And so instead of the local councillor telling him that he doesn't want to see this development happening, he was telling him to move trees and fences and different things, and he's got his architects and his lawyer here to walk us through some of that. So working in good faith with the city, he's not a developer, he's not as familiar with the Planning Act, and was doing those things in good faith to appease and to move forward with the application. And obviously it got caught with interim control, but to add insult to injury, and as stated in the documents from his lawyer as well, there's a similar application that was just as advanced in the planning process, 70 Russell, which passed, and his didn't for whatever reason. So the context in a nutshell, and I'll let I guess Mr. Weber explain on behalf of Mr. Charbelhan the context as well. Thanks.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, is with me, and our architect, Ms. Smith. We concur in everything the councillor has said. That's the essence of the case. Mr. Hanna is a baker and a merchant. From time to time, he invests in residential real property. He bought these 2 properties on Henderson. They'd been used for student housing for years. He continued the use. It became apparent that the buildings were becoming in a rundown condition, and he began exploring alternatives. Had someone explained to him on day one that after he spent $50,000 to advance his applications, cut off by an arbitrary measure, he assures me he just would have spent the $50,000 on the renovations. So that this misleading is critically important, this spinning that's gone on about this case. There are 3 messages I want to give you: that he was misled, that he was first in priority and should not have been preceded by 70 Russell, and thirdly, that you can make all this go away because this is now the last appeal. If this one goes, you can have your interim control bylaw. If we have to go to the OMB, you can't predict how things will turn out, but we may have a shot at knocking the bylaw out together. So there's a common sense element to this. Now, as to misleading, I want you to remember that July 12th, 2017, the glorious 12th, was the day the control bylaw emerged for the first time. So before that, nobody on the outside was aware of the fact that this was coming. On July the 4th, So 8 days earlier, the planning staff in writing said the following: the application is consistent with the policy set out in the general urban area designation in the official plan, which contemplates a range of residential uses. Conforms to the official plan. The proposal is consistent with the policy set out in the low-profile residential designation in the Sandy Hills secondary plan. Conforms with the official plan. The proposed addition conforms to the applicable provisions of the R4H 480 zone in zoning bylaw 280 of 250. Minor variance approval was obtained with the file number for the 203 Henderson side yard to permit a secondary dwelling, as that lot was slightly deficient in both width and area. Conformity with the zoning bylaw. Application will be subject to conditions, including signing a letter of undertaking in order to ensure the site design and building design proceed in accordance with the approved plans, and the site plan is approved that day. So when you read in later reports like today's report, well, there might be a problem with the intent of the official plan, or some might argue that the intent of the zoning bylaw, that's not on. And if these guys want to stand up at the OMB and let me feed this page to them one paragraph at a time, I mean, we're willing to undertake the exercise. That was the planning department's position. 8 days before the interim the interim control bylaw. It was also their position throughout. You see, nobody ever said to Mr. Hanna, oh, we don't like that kind of development. You got a problem with the OP. You got a problem with the zoning. They would say, well, you're going to need a couple of minor variances. Here's what they are. Go and get them. We don't like the facade. We want you to change the materials. Redo your plans. Get a survey done. He did all of that. His applications were made between June and July of 2015. Fully 2 years later, he had complied with every request of the city. He had negotiated this through the ward councillor's office. He negotiated with the community through the minor variance process. Revised plans were endlessly produced, and he spent $50,000 to get to that point. And no one ever said to him, oh, we don't like that, until after the fact. Now, I just say, you know, that that's grossly unfair, that he relied on these representations that he was going in the right way. Why would anybody spend that kind of money if you're going to be told you're cut off at the end? Never mind $100,000 he's going to have to spend to go to the board. He would have said, as he tells me, I just renovate the building. I don't care. You know, I make my money on it anyway. So those misleading facts really led him into this disaster. And I think of it as Lucy in the football. Every time Charlie Brown comes up to kick it, Lucy pulls the football away. Well, it didn't cost Charlie Brown $50,000 if he chose to come back and try and kick the football again. But that was what's going on. Just change that garbage disposal. We don't like that. Bring us in new plans about the garbage disposal. He did. He acted as he was requested to act by responsible city officials. He complied in all times and places. He was misled, and that's an unfair result. Now, on July 5th of 2017, that is to say 7 days before the glorious 12th, he was entitled to a building permit. And he was the only one of all of the applicants who was entitled to a building permit that day. That's because his site plan approval was granted by delegated authority on July the 4th. The Russell, 70 Russell, had the delegated approval withdrawn by Councillor Fleury, and they did not have site plan control approval on that date. We then came to Planning Committee on the 11th, and some of you were there and will remember the show. Various persons were called from the community to talk about the difficulties with these properties, but it was apparent that the Planning Committee was going to give site plan approval to 70 Russell. It was so far down the path. Faced with that, Councillor Fleury then withdrew his withdrawal of delegated authority. Everybody stepped outside and signed a site plan agreement. So as of the 11th of July, 70 Russell caught up to 203, 205 Henderson. Then, of course, on the 12th, when it went to council, we're not there. Nobody knows what happens. Somebody injects an exclusion for Russell. Why? Was there a deal? Was it political? I mean, did somebody just pick and choose?
Let's not go down that line, because I'm not allowing anything like that. Stick to the facts and nothing personal.
We had the right to be in first place. And if you're going to exempt 70 Russell as you did, you should equally exempt 203 and 205 Henderson.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Weber. Mr. Mark? So the interim bylaw that we approved, it's not into effect yet because of the appeals? Or is it in effect?
No, Madam Chair, it takes effect from the day that it's passed. It is subject to repeal, and there is one other appeal. This one is not the only one. There is one in respect of 44 Ontario Street.
No, that appeal's been resolved by the Committee of Adjustments, Mr. Merck. It's gone.
That has not been communicated to me, Madam Chair.
I just communicated it to you.
Okay. Thank you. And so when does remind me, when does the interim control bylaw end?
It ends in July. It is subject to renewal for one further year. The hearing is set for May 7th and 8th of this year, Madam Chair.
Okay. Questions? Anybody? Councillor?
Not questions. I have comments, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
I'd remind committee of a couple of elements, one which is...
Okay, hang on a second. Does anyone have any questions? Wait, hang on. Okay, we'll ask questions of the delegation. Councillor Leeper.
I just want to confirm, intent, if you were moving ahead, was to build a building that has 22 bedrooms in it?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
How many does it have now?
10. How many does 70 Russell have?
But that's not the situation, I think. Question of whom? Of the okay.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you for coming in and making your case today. I appreciate that. A quick question. I'm going through the lobby registry. You said you met with her on a few occasions. Is that correct?
The architect primarily met with staff of the councillor's office, and there were often reports back from the planning department as to the councillor wanted this change or that change or the other change.
Okay, it might just be this database. It's hard to find that or the Russell one, and maybe the councillor can elaborate if he'd met with both when he does his wrap-up or discussion as well. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Questions of staff? Go ahead, Doug. You tell me when you want to speak.
Yeah, I'd like to start just to maybe set the table for the discussion. First and foremost, colleagues, I do think that we have mutual respect in items that we bring to committee, and when items are not in our ward, they do not influence us as much unless they are citywide impacts. As you know, in Sandy Hill, over the last 7 years, we've had 7 reports that relate to the bunkhouse issue. It started off with my first year being elected in late 2010, early 2011, where we brought in an interim control bylaw on conversions. And since then, we're only trying to the issue. I'll finish, and I'd have questions for Mr. Smith and Mr. Mark, but my understanding is that the purpose of an interim control bylaw is to capture an emergency situation, not necessarily to inform property owners of that issue so that the city can further review and analyze and come back with zoning solutions on the matter. That's why, if you recall, there's a lot of reference to the 70 Russell issue. We have to keep in mind that in Sandy Hill, one of the measures that we landed over the 6 different reports, one was the site plan light, which meant that someone couldn't just walk in to the development review office downstairs, submit their floor plans and building, and get a go-ahead. They required site plan. That required site plan, even if I didn't agree with the zoning, didn't give me the tools to not allow the development to proceed. So when the applicant wasn't properly informed by his team that there's nothing we could do, even if we don't like the number of bedrooms, even if we don't like the inside layout, if it meets the building code that was required at that time, we can only work through site plan issues. That said, we did inform the applicant we were not comfortable with the amount of bedrooms that they were proceeding with, but that was not a tool that we could hook in the site plan discussions. So doing the bit of aside, because I know there was references to the 70, what happened with the 70 Russell is that a similar type of building, but the building was, in my belief, of heritage significance. And the only way to bring that to committee's table, I don't want to burden committee's efforts. I didn't bring all of the bunkhouse issues, all the site plan issues to committee, but we chose that one for strategic reason, for the interim control bylaw purposes, but also because we wanted to make a hearing of the heritage components of the 70 Russell property. If you remember and recall, there was lengthy discussions on the type of built form of bedrooms and why bunkhouses weren't desirable. The word from our legal team at the time was to say, committee doesn't really have a hold and a decision to make at that point because it's a site plan and there's no real site plan issues on the 70 Russell. That's why I then pull the delegated authority and allow the staff proceeding to continue. But at that same meeting, council and committee made a really important decision, which was to land the interim control bylaw, to capture in a lot of these zones, and I'll let Mr. Smith speak to it, all of those properties that are bunkhouses, and to allow staff to further review. In my area, to this date, there's 16 left. There's 16 of them that we could have pulled out. They could, again, use a different counselor to bring it back to the floor of committee. Those issues continue to exist in every ward where those properties that were in process are captured. Again, it's permitted in zoning. So I don't like that the applicant says, if you didn't like the bedrooms, you should have told us. We clearly told you, but there's nothing that we can do in zone because we're not reviewing the zoning. So that's the tool of the interim control bylaw that is in front of us. So not only do I feel that that the motion is not respectful of a colleague, as you know, we all work hard in our own areas, and I don't think that it's helpful to come in on such a complex issue in an area like Sandy Hill on the interim control bylaw and on the R4 and on the bunkhouse issue. But I also believe that, as staff wrote in the memo relating to this motion, that it is a bunkhouse, and staff recognize that. So I ask committee to uphold the decision of the interim control bylaw and to not allow a bunkhouse to proceed.
Can I just ask you a question about the other one that went through? How many, but wasn't it like 20 rooms or something like that? Wasn't it? So really your argument is for the heritage because you wanted to highlight the fact to protect it from as
so you have to recall the 70 Russell discussion. We didn't have the interim control bylaw. We were working at it with Mr. Mark and Mr. Willis at the time. In the background, we knew that we needed to pick one of the prime example of why bunkhouses were an issue in an area, and collectively we chose that 70 Russell was an example. I had pulled delegated authority because I couldn't get clarity on the facade, the brick. As you recall, there was red brick on the 70 Russell property. So it was one that was worth coming to committee, but from the legal staff's, when legal staff presented to committee saying, committee, I don't know what you're going to vote on really. You only look at the site plan. There's nothing in zoning. There's no real infraction to the site plan. So I, at that point, removed delegated authority and allowed staff to proceed with the work on that front.
So you have to understand why it's confusing, because it does sound from what Mr. Mark said too, is that the property that we've had the over today was actually farther advanced in the process, and yet it's being punished when the other one wasn't. And I think that first of all, I agree with you about the fact that it's not a local. You're the counselor, and nobody in this room enjoys this. I think it's a situation of people wanting fairness in it, and maybe to find a way that doesn't open the door for all the rest of it that we're trying to stop, and doesn't put it at the discretion of an Ontario Municipal Board appeal whenever that time comes, and that sort of thing. And I think, you don't have a machine here, which we know in this city, we know, who are out there picking neighborhoods to attack. This is somebody who is, I don't know, they're not. Yes, please. Go ahead. I was asking questions of the councillor, because that's what I was trying to do.
But it was actually a staff report that came to council in July. Staff supported, so
I'm here to speak to that.
So since it was in my ward too, I don't see it as a councillor's obligation to answer questions that staff supported. So you can ask those questions of Mr. Mark or Mr.
Sure,
Smith.
who are we going to ask?
It's not fair to pick on one of the four
No, I was
councillors
just
who were
trying
captured
to
in the area.
What
So
is that?
my question to Mr. Mark is as follows. If I'm a homeowner and I'm captured by the interim control bylaw, there he is there a process by which I can go to committee of adjustment?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Correct. So I can tell you that I had a number of building owners come to me after the interim control bylaw was enacted, because part of the area included areas of my ward. And my advice to them was, if you go to the committee of adjustment, you can argue the case. And I believe some of them have done so successfully. Is that your understanding as well?
I only get the ones that are appealed, Madam Chair, and
well, I can tell you from my recollection that one in particular that I know of went to committee of adjustment, successfully changed to the committee of adjustment, and as a result of that was able to proceed. So I think that's important context here, that council in its wisdom unanimously passed an interim control bylaw. It allows a building owner to go to the committee of adjustment. Many have. So again, I think that's important context here. My second question relates to whether or not staff are aware of what the likely impact would have been if staff or council had provided notice weeks in advance of passing the interim control bylaw. What would one anticipate have been the likely outcome of that kind of notice?
Madam Chair, it's fair to say that the very purpose of an interim control bylaw is to bring an immediate stop to building permit applications because of what is in council's mind a pressing planning concern. If one provides notice of it, then one can expect a rush to building code services in order to complete the permit process.
So it strikes me as having been a reasonable way of enacting an interim control bylaw for a planning issue which both planning staff, legal staff, and certainly the councillors impacted felt required the tools of an interim control bylaw. Is that correct?
It was enacted in a typical fashion, which is with no notice at all.
Right. Am I right that it had the support of both planning staff and legal staff?
With respect, Madam Chair, legal staff doesn't provide an opinion as to whether or not it's appropriate. It's our role to see that it's done legally, and I will let Mr. Smith answer if it had the support of planning staff.
Madam Chair, we clearly recognize there was a significant issue that we're facing in Sandy Hill, but not just exclusively in Sandy Hill, and it was the whole bunkhouse issue, and we saw that this was a continuing issue that we were being challenged with, notwithstanding incremental steps that were being taken over the years to try to manage and deal with it, and a determination was made that we actually needed to take a much more comprehensive look at this and give us time to actually undertake that. We had initiated the R4, but the R4 was not able to get concluded in enough time to be able to really deal with the issue. So it was really, from planning staff's perspective, there was a need to ensure that we're able to make some headway in moving forward on the R4 and deal with the issue once and for all.
Thank you. Is this the time to make a wrap-up comment, or do you want me to wait?
Still more questions.
Okay. I will come back on the list when the questions are finished.
Councillor Leeper.
Thank you,
I just want to deal as well with some of the assertions we heard from the appellant in this one with respect to being led down the garden path. They have told us that they were told at multiple points by planning staff that they were in conformity with the official plan. I presume that even when planning staff do not agree with the general thrust of where development is going, that if something conforms with a particular regulation, that they are told that it conforms, right? I'll take that as a yes.
Illegal.
Yep.
Madam Chair, of course, I can't speak for my development review colleagues with respect to what it is that they did and didn't say. What I would say is with respect to the official plan, certainly the official plan contemplates development, which this development would satisfy. Right. It is of that height range that is in there. It is certainly on the lot that the official plan would contemplate for being there and being as such and being there as well too. With respect to the zoning bylaw, we have to recall as well too that the zoning bylaw does not put a cap on bedrooms. Right. And so a development application, when it comes through, we are obligated to process a development application as it comes through with statutory timelines applicable to both the Planning Act and also from City Council as well too.
And this is why we have the interim control bylaw mechanism, I believe, is because from time to time, the zoning, the official plan, the regulatory regime allows that are counter to the public interest. And so we have the ability through the interim control bylaw to stop from being built things that would otherwise be permitted to be built. So I do not believe in this instance that they were led down the garden path. They were being given accurate answers to their questions. Unfortunately, the accurate answers to their questions are leading to a place that is counter to the public interest, at least until we have a good understanding through our R4 study of whether these sorts of developments should be permitted moving ahead. So I have a really difficult time having sympathy for that argument. Yes, the information was accurate. That doesn't mean the development should be allowed to go ahead. Have we ever telegraphed an ICBY in past and given notice to the industry that we are about to pass one?
I am relying on the fog of my memory, Madam Chair. I think that one of the intercontrol bylaws that were done in Council 12, Ward 12, by the current council's predecessor may have had some notice.
Whenever we've passed these, it generally comes as a surprise to the industry. Thank you.
Anybody? Councillor Kakish? Anybody have any more questions? Councillor Vice Chair Tierney.
Very quick. Thanks, Tim. I know this is a lot, and I'm glad the councillor's here, and I'll save my other components for wrap-up. Real quickly, you were aware in December that Councillor Kakish was looking at bringing the motion possibly directly to council?
I was, Madam Chair.
And was the councillor aware of that as well?
No, I don't believe. Certainly, I had not advised the council.
Matt, did you know that? Don't recall. Okay, good. So just so you know, from December until now, at the request of many people saying, to be able to go through appropriate process, to go through committee, this is the channel we should use. And myself as vice chair, I'm there to help assist in motions for people that don't sit on this committee. That's how it got to this point. I think this is also allowed for great dialogue and discussion around the table, but I just wanted clarification on the councillor was informed. Do we inform councillors when things go to councillor that affect their ward?
Madam Chair, certainly when the matter becomes public, I ensure that all appropriate people are informed, and so the moment the motion was introduced to council, I informed the ward councillor, I informed the applicant.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Question, Councillor Cloutier.
Mr. Mark, what prevents the applicant from going to Committee of Adjustment now?
Nothing.
And they would decide, there would be a resolution one way or another based on the 4 pillars of the Committee of Adjustment?
That's correct. To be fair to the applicant, there's a fee that has to be paid, and there is a process associated with it, but nothing prevents him from going.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Mark, just so I'm 100% clear. Mr. Mark? So just so I'm 100% clear in the committee as well, the main argument from the delegate today that we were so far along in this process and we didn't get notice that the interim control bylaw motion was coming and it nailed us at the last second, or are there any issues where there were delays caused by the city which contributed to them not getting through this process before the interim control bylaw went into effect?
Mr. Chair, it's not my role to make the argument for the applicant for the relief in front of committee. Committee heard what they said, and they received both. They heard the presentation today, and then of course was a submission back in November as a communication to council. That's just that occurred, and it's for committee to decide whether or not that changes their mind.
But there's a normal process that these types of files go through. Were there any delays caused by the city which contributed to them not meeting this process before the interim control bylaw motion was passed? Did the city contribute to that delay?
I am not in a position to confirm or to refute the process that was followed on the application of 203-205 Henderson.
Looking around to see if there's any further questions of staff at this point. Seeing as there's none, wrap up. Who would like to begin? Toby.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So I would encourage colleagues to vote against this motion for a couple of reasons. One of them is I think we have a perfectly good process available in the City of Ottawa to those who feel aggrieved by the interim control bylaw, which is go to the Committee of Adjustment, which we have delegated to address matters of minor variances. And if someone feels that they would otherwise meet the spirit and intent of the four-part test, they have every ability to do so. As I mentioned earlier, I had a number of building owners come to me after the implementation of the interim control bylaw. I, respecting Council's wishes with the unanimous passing of it, advised them to go to the Committee of Adjustment, and I'm happy to note that at least one was successful in getting the zoning they required, and they were able to draw their building permit. So in this case, we have a good reason why the applicant in question couldn't go to the Committee of Adjustment, seek their approval that way. And I think if we start willy-nilly accepting applications like this, it's going to be very difficult to achieve the objective of the interim control bylaw, which was precisely to not allow these buildings to move forward for a period of 12 months, to give the staff an opportunity to do the R4 review and figure out and come back and provide us advice, presumably and by the end of this, this council term, on how they think we ought to move forward on this. It strikes me as being a highly reasonable proposal. A number of wards were captured, mine included. Again, I have advised a number of building owners that the Committee of Adjustment is the proper process, and I don't really think that this is an appropriate way to do that. So on that basis, I would strongly encourage colleagues to vote against this motion. I think it's improper, and I don't think it captures the intent of what Council did when it passed this interim control law back. Thank you.
Next. Councillor Kakish.
Thank you, Chair, and on wrap up, I mean, first of all, I want to address the point that this is an issue that's outside of my ward, and I have, no interest or enjoyment of doing this. I'm doing this as a matter of principle, because I think what Mr. Hanna's is not fair based on the facts that his lawyer has outlined before us today. And before I ran for office, I worked for Shenko too, and he represented Capital Ward, which had a lot of infill development at the time, and any of those meetings we had with the applicants that came forward, he was very clear that he didn't support that kind of development and that kind of construction in his area. So, and we heard from the applicant that had he received those messages early on, he wouldn't have invested. Why would he have invested $50,000 of his money had he been given that message from the councillor at the time. So I don't buy that. I don't buy that he was told that and he did proceed with it anyways. He's a bakery owner. He's not knowledgeable in the planning process. He was working in good faith based on feedback that he was being given from planning and from the local councillor. And this notion that there's 16 other properties who and this willy-nilly thing that we're going to be doing, the 2 properties, this one and the other one, 70 Russell, are the only 2 that were very advanced in the process. 3 years he's been working on this, making changes. And you saw what Tim Mark said. He couldn't say, if anything, that the city staff told him to do, change things. I take that as a yes, because they kept on dragging this on and on by telling him to move a tree or move a fence to keep dragging it on. Interim control stuff and infill development has been a problem for many years. None of us support bunkhouses. The local councillor should have made that clear to him on day one when he came in with that 22-room plan. He shouldn't have waited 3 years to let him know that that was happening. And the point of interim control is to stop everything in the tracks. But again, there was nothing that prevented the local councillor from being very clear and upfront about that from the get-go. So we're giving preferential treatment to 70 Russell, which was just as advanced in the application process. And we're telling this person here, who was working in good faith with the city, doing everything he was told to do by planning and the local councillor, no, sorry, interim control we're not bending the rules for you. We'll bend it for 70 Russell for who knows why. I'm not going to speculate on why, but we've heard from the lawyer about delegated authority withdrawing and then withdrawing the withdrawal of delegated authority. So I'll leave it at that. And as I said, I have no interest in meddling in anyone else's backyard. I've been here all day too for this, waiting for this item, when I could be doing many other better things, but this is a matter of principle for me. And if we're going to make someone spend $50,000 of their money and not be upfront with them and mislead them, I don't think that's fair to a resident. Thank you.
No, I want back on. And the reason is, I think as a point of clarification, I should note, again, my ward was on this interim control bylaw. I think I was informed, if memory serves, at 9 o'clock the morning that this was brought to council. So I just want to state that if there had been a builder who had come to me and said, hey, I'm planning to do this, and I looked at all of the official plan and zoning bylaw and requirements, and it had passed them, it was consistent with them, I would have had to have said, this is either consistent, if it was, if I had said that message 24 hours before the interim control bylaw, would you accuse me of having misled the builder when I had no idea the interim control bylaw was coming? So I think I would be very careful.
I don't know any urban councilor that's ever supported a bunkhouse, and that's the point here. It doesn't matter whether there's interim or...
The point is, I think I take issue with an accusation.
It's not working. No. Okay. Okay. You know what?
So I think that's important clarification.
It's been a long day, and it's almost like a question of being put the question, but I think that Councillor Fleury has to have an opportunity. Are you finished yet? You're done? Sure? Councillor Fleury.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. I think I was clear about 70 Russell, so I don't want to go back there, and I think the purpose of this 70 Russell was to drop the interim control bylaw. So I don't think I need to go back there. We are in full mode for the interim control bylaw, and David Wise and his team is coming forward with the R4 at some point this year, which I'm confident will bring some resolution to the bunkhouse issue. I don't think there's a resident in Sandy Hill, I don't think there's a property owner in Sandy Hill that thinks that the bunkhouses are desirable or that I'm supportive of them. So when I hear a colleague saying we weren't clear, I think we're confusing the fact that if you meet zoning, we have to work with you on the site plan. So we could disagree with the amount of height, we could disagree with the amount of bedrooms, we could disagree with everything, but if it meets zoning, it's not a point of discussion. So it's not a starting point. So, you know, I know it's frustrating for communities that don't have necessarily to deal with site plan all the time, but in this context, in a lot of urban contexts, the zoning's in place, we work through the site plan components. I want to go specifically for this application in the context of the interim control bylaw, and that will be the end of my comments. So the development is in contravention of criteria A and C of the interim control bylaw in the following matters. The principal dwelling unit proposed for 203 Anderson will include 7 bedrooms and exceeds the 120 square meters floor area. The principal dwelling unit proposed for 205 Henderson will include 8 bedrooms and exceed 120 square meters on the floor area. The total area of 203 and 205 Henderson include both principal dwelling units, and all included secondary dwelling units exceeds 500 square meters in total floor area, which again are the goals of the interim control bylaw. So in my mind, I asked committee members, there's 16 applicants that spent money and their effort in bringing applications. Some are more or less advanced. That's nor here nor there. The idea is that when this committee approved the interim control bylaw, when council approved the interim control bylaw, it parameters, and this property was captured in the parameters. It's clearly a bunkhouse.
But then so is Russell. Right? Never mind.
Are we done?
Everybody's done? Okay. Yeas and nays? Councillor Blair. Oh, wait a minute. Let me just say what we're doing here. We are repeal of bylaw number 2017 as it relates to the lands, 245 interim control bylaw, as it relates to the lands known municipally as 203 and 205 Henderson Avenue. Okay?
Got it.
So yes is remove it, and no is stick with it. Okay? All right, so Councillor Blais.
Yes.
Councillor Brockington.
No.
Councillor Shirelli, gone. Councillor Cloutier.
No.
Councillor Hubley. Oh, he's gone too. Councillor Leeper.
No.
Councillor Nussbaum.
No.
Councillor Kadri.
No.
Chair Tierney.
Yes.
Myself, no. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 to 2. Okay. But so before did we get an answer on? It doesn't matter. I'll ask Mr. Mark before he leaves. Oh, we haven't done everything. You have a notice of motion. Vice Chair Tierney, you have a notice of motion.
Yes, I'll just quickly go over this, where the development charge bylaw review conducted every 5 years pursuant to the requirements outlined in the Development Charges Act, whereas the City of Ottawa must pass a new development charges bylaw by May 2019 before various bylaws expire, whereas the City will undertake the DC background studies and the bylaw is consistent with the requirements of the amended DCA, whereas the development charges impact all areas of the city, whereas a council sponsor group will be able to provide valuable stakeholder input into the DC bylaw review. Therefore, it be resolved that Planning Committee recommend council approve the following councillors of members be a part of the Development Charge Bylaw Sponsors Group: Jan Harder, Alan Hubley, Stephen Blais, Scott Moffat, and Jeff Leeper. They all have various roles, whether it's urban representative, member of ARAC, transit, audit, and planning committees.
Well, for the chairs and the various. That's very exciting. Yeah, we're so excited to have them on. I know. Well, official plan probably tops it. That's a notice of motion. Why are we here? Other business? None. I don't think there is. We don't have another. We're adjourned. The next meeting isn't until the 27th of March. So if you want to go away and get a little break, this would be the time. Thank you, everybody, for a wild and crazy ride. Yep.